What's beef when it comes for you? What you gonna say when the beef comes your way? What you gonna do? What you gonna search for when beef comes your way? What's beef when the problem comes your way? Hate crimes every single day happen. What happens if it comes to you? This knocks at your door. What you gonna do? What's your point of view? Beef. What you gonna do with this beef when it comes after you? This moment of your life passing through. What you gonna say in a split second? This moment of yours, this momentum going with the sound control, take it over. What you gonna do when this beef takes over? What you gonna do when the beef comes after you? What you gonna do when this is what lifestyle you see? You don't understand where you go from here. You got to understand the beef when you don't have to explain yourself. You got to understand when the beef doesn't go your way. You got to understand when the beef cannot fly you high. You got to understand when the beef is not here in your face. You got to understand when it walks straight to you, when you're directly walking in your path, when this beef catch to you. You got to understand when this beef takes over control. You got to understand the beatbox want to play a beat, it makes sense, a melody flows with love. You got to understand the beef when it comes for you. You got to understand when this moment happens to your past. You got to know what happens right in this moment. You got to be in the moment like a warrior. You got to understand this way of past. You got to understand the way of the knowledge goes. You got to understand how it goes. You got to go with the moment to find that beef goes away. You got to find that moment, that flow, that luck. You got to have the moment in your heart and the moment in your mind so this bottle doesn't overfill and takes over control. You got to understand what's beef. When the beef comes after you, when this beef is taking over, when you're eating it like in your dinner plate, if you knew what this beef is doing, if you knew how to treat it, you got to understand how beef comes after you. Every day you will go to the shop and you see the beef in your face. You got to understand this hate crime's happening. When you walk straight through this mountain, this peak doesn't even matter. What are you going to do when the beef comes after you? When you hear that, you got to understand where you're going with this moment and this memento. You got to understand when this beef is coming after you, when this beef is trying to walk straight past you, when it means you're a waste of space, you're just a broken fool, like wasted on the face, on the floor. You got to understand what happens when the beef comes after you. What you got to do when the beef is on you? You got to understand where this beef is going. You got to understand where this flow is going. You got to understand how this goes. You got to understand when the beef is after you. You got to understand when you open the door. You take a look in the peak hole. You got to understand when the beef comes after you. When this glass comes after you. You got to understand when the beef is coming. You got to know when the beef is coming. You need to be a warrior to know the beef. You got to understand when this happens. When you fly so high and you come right down, you got to understand how the beef lands. You got to understand how it goes. You got to know this momentum for your life. You got to know when you got to do what you got to do at the right time, at the split second. You got to know how to get those instincts going. Train yourself to be somebody better on yourself. You got to understand when the beef comes. You got to understand when the beef is here. You got to understand where the beef is living. You got to understand where the beef is coming from. You got to understand this information, this cooking in the lab, setting things on the table. You got to understand this plate, what it's cooked with. You got to understand what eats off this plate. You got to understand where this is coming from. You got to know when the beef is coming after you. You got to know when the beef is coming after you. When the beef is coming, you got to know. You got to know this flow, how it goes. This melody of the voice, this miracles and this curses, how it goes. You got to understand how it is. Life should be experienced in the sole of your feet. You got to understand when you walk down the road. You got to understand when the beef is happening. You got to understand when move out of the way. Make the smart decision and go the right way. You got to understand the beef. You got to understand how it goes. You got to understand how this beef is taking over control. How this noise control possesses you all the way. Full matter doesn't matter anymore. It's just self-awareness taking over your mind. You got to understand you got a subconscious. You got to understand you got a psyche. You got to understand when the beef comes after you. When you drown yourself with some drugs, you got to understand your brain is going to rot. Your capacity of your brain is not going to work. You got to understand when the beef comes after you. You got to understand what you're doing with the beef. You got to understand how this beef goes. You got to understand how it is making you feel when you're flying that high. You got to understand how what the beef does to you. You got to understand how this beef go. I say I'm Zero Beef. Much love. Peace out.